right, so let's talk now about the epidemiology itself, which is by definition the study of the spread, control, and prevention of disease. So epidemiologists compile data to describe what's happening and allow them to better understand the factors that are important. This kind of research allows us to change things like public policy and human behavior, so it's led to, for instance, widespread hand washing and recommendations for hand washings, wastewater treatment, waste removal, and overall water treatment. Again, communicable or contagious diseases are transmitted from host to host, and they're present in a reservoir. This term means this is the natural habitat for whatever pathogen. That could be humans, it might be animals, it could be the soil and water, and it could be multiple places. Transmission refers to transfer between hosts, and usually it's through water, food, or some vector, or from mother to child. So we're going to talk about these terms in epidemiology: incidence, prevalence, endemic, epidemic, and pandemic. And you could definitely be asked a test question about this that requires you to define these terms or use them in a sentence or understand them in some way. So incidence is the fraction of the population that contracts a disease over time. So in order to know what this is, you have to define your time period, and you're looking at new cases in time period X. So you might be looking at the incidence in 2012, which would be all of the new cases in 2012. If you have someone who was diagnosed in 2011, they don't get counted in that number. Prevalence is the fraction of population that has a specific disease at a particular time. So it's like a little snapshot. So we go on May 5th, 2012, and we just count everybody who has it. An endemic disease is one that's always there. Okay, so an example would be the common cold or the flu is pretty much always present in the human population. Depending on where you live in the world, there could be something that's endemic to this region and not to that. So malaria is endemic to sub-Saharan Africa and really is not found here anymore. An epidemic is a disease acquired by many hosts in a given area in a short time. What is the reference? How do we tell, many hosts? That's an unusually large number. So it could be an endemic disease that spikes in number. So if there's normally like 10% people infected and now there's 90%, that's an epidemic. If it's a disease that hasn't been normally found or is, seasonal or something like that. But it refers to an unusually large number of cases. And so it can be from an introduced disease or from an endemic disease that is a much higher level than normal. If we're referring to a pandemic, that means that we're looking at something that has a worldwide spread, so over the whole globe, pretty much. And AIDS is considered to be a pandemic because it affects multiple continents. This term is important to know: herd immunity. Herd immunity is when most of the people in the population have natural immunity, and that actually, because every time there's a host that's immune, it's a block to transmission. So if you're, say, immune to malaria, then a mosquito lands on you and bites you and neither gives you the infection nor does it get it from you, and so then it goes away. And if it was a naive mosquito and it bit you, it can't transmit it to the next person. Herd immunity, also an example would be if most of the population is vaccinated against, say, the measles. It's hard to actually spread it in that population if, say, 95% of people are protected. So certain diseases are monitored by the CDC. In the US, reportable diseases that are followed are sort of listed here. These are considered notifiable diseases that if you come into a clinic with these, then the physician has to report those cases. And that means there's really good data on the number of people with it, at least the number of diagnosed people. Obviously, if you're sick and you stay at home, you won't be notifiable, really. You just can't, you're not part of the statistics. But there's decent statistics on all of these diseases because of their requirement for being notifiable. So you would have to report your specified disease to various officials. And if it's a nationally notifiable disease, you are required to report it. Okay, so a few more terms. Morbidity, mortality, morbidity rate, and mortality rate, because these are terms that are frequently used. The top two are ones that you would have to know for an exam, especially. The sort of nuances between morbidity and morbidity rate I probably wouldn't test you on. But morbidity is the incidence of a specific notifiable disease. Okay, so it is how many new cases are reported in some given period of time. Mortality is the deaths from that disease. Okay, so that's the difference between you have it versus you die from it. Okay, now let's talk about how you get diseases. So you have to consider reservoirs, which is where the disease is hanging out, and transmission, which is how it moves between hosts. So here's an example. For instance, if we're talking about, say, HIV, which causes AIDS, or the gonorrhea bacterium, both of these their reservoirs are in human hosts. They're not able to live in other hosts. So they're both infecting humans, and they're also the reservoir, the place where you get more of them is in humans. These are actually the easiest types of diseases to control. Why? Why would it be easier to control, say, gonorrhea or even smallpox than, for instance, rabies? You can control people more easily than you can control every single bat that lives on planet Earth, right? So one reason is that you can have public information, you can also have regulations, you can also sort of see people, and people tend to be able to talk to each other. Smallpox is the most successful eradicated disease, which is interesting because it's typically, it can be fatal, it's very devastating, it's extremely contagious, and it was in the human population throughout our history, through our recorded history, and probably before we had records. And it was eradicated completely because all you need to do is vaccinate everybody. Now, animal reservoirs would include things like rabies or Lyme disease, right, where the natural reservoir it's found in the animal population. It may or may not make the animal sick. And then it gets into the human population through a bite or through an insect bite. And these are called zoonoses or zoonotic infections. Another source, another reservoir is our environment, okay? So, for instance, endospores in the soil that cause botulism or that cause tetanus, they're living in the soil naturally, right? And they're not making the soil sick because the soil isn't living in that way. But if they get into humans, they will cause disease. Now, these are the hardest to control, right? Because it's very difficult to go and just take every grain of dirt and, sterilize it or something. Routes of transmission, direct contact is pretty straightforward. That would be either, skin-to-skin contact or sexual contact, but direct human contact. And the case of direct contact, the number of cells or viruses that you get in that contact are important. So a smaller number gives you less of a chance of being infected, and it's easier for our immune system to control before it gets out of hand. Indirect contact is by objects. We call them fomites. So just remember that crazy term that, I can't give you a reason that it's called that. I actually don't know, but it might be from either Latin or Greek. But basically it would be, let's suppose that you had a cold and you sneezed into a Kleenex and then you left the Kleenex on the table. That Kleenex is a fomite, okay? Droplet transmission, obviously, if you're aerosolized, and if that's how you transmit viruses, especially often, or by droplet transmission, but not always. You can also have food and water, including cross-contamination of food, so that's considered a route of transmission. Now, vectors that are part of this transmission can be either mechanical or biological. So if it's biological, it means that it's involved in the life cycle of the pathogen. This is an example of contamination in the air. We did this experiment, right? We know that in the air there's lots of stuff, and if you collect it on a Petri dish, you can grow it. There's probably more stuff in the air than we were able to grow because some of those things were viruses, which we wouldn't have seen. and some of them might be things that don't grow well on the plate we gave them. But interestingly, and maybe unsurprisingly, the number of bacteria in the air rises in direct proportion to the number of people in the room, which suggests that our bacteria are getting out in our exhalations. They're not just, they're not just inside of us. So this is just some examples of direct contact transmission, droplet transmission, and fomite, which would be some intermediate. You touch a glass or a fork or a plate. Your non-living reservoirs, food, water, and air. Vector transmission, again, I said it could be mechanical or biological. So vectors can be arthropods, so fleas, ticks, mosquitoes, that transmit disease either mechanically or biologically. So mechanical is if you're transmitting disease because your fly lands on the potato salad and it gets some salmonella bacteria on its feet and it flies over to a sandwich and then it walks on the sandwich, okay, or on your face. That would be mechanical. It carries whatever on its feet or on its body and you get sick that way. Most of the time we're dealing with biological vector transmission. And this would be like malaria, where the pathogen reproduces inside of the insect, and then it's part of its life cycle. Okay, so again, just to remind you of the various things that can be done to reduce disease, primarily sanitation. If you understand your reservoirs and your vectors, so where is it normally and what vectors are transmitting it, then you can control those things. Vaccination is helpful, antibiotic use is helpful. There are emerging diseases, so these are things that are sort of cropping up that are new-ish. And an example, for instance, would be E. coli 0157H7 is sort of considered relatively new. AIDS is considered new since the 80s, right? This is prion disease, so another word for this is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease or prion disease or mad cow disease. They all are the same, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, meaning basically that you get this prion from eating contaminated meat that then destroys your brain. It eats holes in your brain. And that's pretty new. Now, prion diseases are probably not new to the human population, but we did not understand them for a long time. So in cannibalistic cultures, there probably have been, especially cultures that eat brains, there probably have been prion illnesses that just went unrecognized. People didn't know that that's why people were sick. Ebola is another emerging disease that is thought to have sort of first come into the population in the 70s. It's debatable. I mean, many of these may have been around before and we just didn't know, right? So when we're dealing with an emerging disease, we'd like to understand the contributing factors. Usually it's occurring because of genetic recombination. So if it's a truly emerging disease, such as E. coli 0157H7. This, remember, it got its Shigella toxin from a horizontal transfer event. So Shigella has a toxin, and at some point in the recent history of its evolution, that there was a virus that infected Shigella and then went and infected E. coli, and E. coli picked up this toxin. The flu is also an example of emerging infectious disease because it's constantly mutating, and each time it sort of comes up, it's a new strain that we don't have immunity to. Also, new strains can evolve just by simple mutation. Cholera, for instance, is one such example, new strains of cholera. We can also force this or select for it by overusing antibiotics and pesticides. So if we sort of use antibiotics in a really widespread way or use pesticides in a widespread way, it's like a evolutionarily selective mechanism that drives the survival of resistant species or strains that might have existed before but in really low numbers, but now they're in much higher numbers and now they're getting all over the place. So antibiotic resistant strains, for instance, Staphylococcus aureus, what is the disease that you can catch in the hospital that is staph, a version of staph that's a result of antibiotic resistance being acquired. MRSA, and now VRSA, right? VRSA is the latest, it's resistant to vancomycin, and so we're seeing, it's like we're actually selecting for, doing this experiment on our own population on accident to select for resistant strains of bacteria. Changes in weather patterns can result in emerging diseases. Hantavirus is one example. We can also have things happen because of modernizing transportation. So as you increase the ability of people to move around the world, you can bring diseases from, say, Egypt to America. Various kinds of instability in the sort of in the geography or in the political realm, or changes in human behavior can lead to emerging diseases. And also animal control measures. It's thought that Lyme disease is actually on the rise because of that. We've already talked about this, but emerging diseases can occur as a result of crossing the species barrier. If we're looking at things like nosocomial infections, then we know that what that means is stuff we acquire in a hospital, right? More likely to acquire in a hospital. And 5 to 15% of hospital patients are affected by this. I'm going to skip that, and I want to sort of ask you this question. This is data from the CDC looking at different infections that people acquire in a hospital setting. So what kinds are they? You can have skin infections, bacteremia that's transmitted by IV, especially if you have an IV in for a long time, that increases your risk. Lower respiratory infections, that makes sense. People get sick and then it spreads quickly throughout the hospital. Lots of people packed together with low immune systems. You can get an infection at the surgery site. But by far the most common kind of nosocomial infection is a UTI. Why is that? Any ideas? If you have surgery, what's one of the things that most likely is going to happen to you? Yeah, they're going to catheterize you. And basically, while they try to keep that sterile, they're going to shove a foreign object up your urethra and possibly allow the transmission of bacteria. If you have the catheter in for longer, it's going to be more of a risk. So UTIs are a very common nosocomial infection that you have to worry about. So these are some of the causative agents that are causing these problems in hospitals. So we have some Staphylococci, different strains of those, some Enterococci, gram-negative rods, and Clostridium difficile you've probably heard of, right, which is also a common nosocomial infection. MRSA, which is another real concern in hospitals, has several different strains. So there's some that are found in the healthcare setting and some that are found in the community.